The member for Burwood.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. It's common practice in this place for people to say, it gives me pleasure to speak on Bill X or Bill Y. I don't think anyone could really purport to genuinely take pleasure in having to address some of these matters, because the crimes we are seeking to legislate today are so heinous, so confronting, so enormously upsetting that even speaking about them certainly fills me with some dread. I want to thank the member for Wendouree for her passionate contribution. I know these are really difficult matters to address in a public forum. I know that the subject matter of this bill is enormously confronting, but nonetheless we are tasked as legislators in this place to address the full gamut of human behaviour, no matter how bad it might be. I wanted to spend a bit of time in my contribution today on one particular aspect of this bill, which hasn't been particularly well traversed by other speakers, and I offer absolutely no criticism of that, but merely to say that it hasn't been the focus necessarily of some of the contributions. And it goes to the new section we propose to introduce, 36AA, circumstances in which a person does not consent. And the bill provides that circumstances in which a person does not consent to an act include, but are not limited to, the following, and lists a range of things. But I want to draw the House's attention particularly to subclause M, which says the act occurs in the provision of commercial sexual services and the person engages in the act because of a false or misleading representation that the person will be paid. Now, this government, under the leadership of the Minister at the table, has done extraordinary work in protecting sex workers, because we agree that sex work is real work, and we think sex workers ought to have safe workplaces as well. That very, very important work has been widely welcomed by those people employed in the sex work industry. And I had the pleasure of recently meeting with an advocate from the Sex Work Law Reform Victoria group, and spending a bit of time discussing with him some of the challenges that professional sex workers face in Victoria, and indeed perhaps right across the nation. He had a recent and difficult experience in debating the sex work decriminalisation bill, and I accept that that's not the bill before the chamber, but it is in fact on a related topic, where he gave a submission to the Burundara Council about it and was drowned out by anti-sex worker voices, including my prospective opponent in Ringwood, Cynthia Watson. And that was a pretty unedifying display of sitting councillors seeking to tear down the person delivering the argument, not tear down the argument itself. And their stance on this very important legislation was shameful, because it just didn't accept any of the realities of sex work, and didn't accept what we know to be the reality, that through decriminalisation we have made sex work and sex workers safer. But under this bill, as I've outlined, we criminalise false or misleading representations about payment for commercial sexual services, because that is a condition precedent for consent if you are a sex worker. Quite obviously it is. And what we do is we make sure that it isn't just about that we replace what was the lesser offence of procuring a sexual act by fraud, that we elevate it so that in some situations the conduct of asserting that you will pay for a sexual service and then not in fact making that payment, that could be considered rape or sexual assault. Now, my discussion with this advocate, Matthew, was enlightening, because he said it is frequently reported by people who work as private escort type workers. They're not typically in a formal setting like a brothel or an establishment type setting. They tend to work privately. They're call-out workers, if you like. They provide those services at different locations. But he reported a significant a significant pattern of behaviour whereby people ring their banks post-transaction and seek to have the transaction nullified by erroneously, dishonestly asserting to the bank that it has been obtained fraudulently. And the behaviour of banks routinely on these matters is to automatically side with the procurer of those services, not the provider of those services. That there is an operating presumption inside banking that in fact people providing sex work services are the ones to be disbelieved and their clients are to always be believed. And it actually extends terrifyingly, Deputy Speaker, to even the provision of other banking services. And I'll have some more to say about this another day perhaps, but I'll flag for the benefit of the chamber that there is some reprehensible conduct going on inside the financial services industry in Australia that means that people who are full-time sex workers, or their chosen profession is that of sex work, cannot get home loans at particular banks and cannot even, astonishingly, open bank accounts, savings accounts, with particular financial institutions. As I say, I'll have more to say about that in future, but it astonishes me that there is still this stigmatisation of sex workers by the Boroondara Council, by my prospective opponent in Ringwood, and by others that seeks to devalue them, devalue their work, and provide this operating assumption that what they are doing is in some way immoral, unethical, or allows people to validly assume that they are somehow dishonest in what they're going about doing. And nothing, in fact, could be further from the truth. It is an outrage, Deputy Speaker, that people are engaging in this sort of conduct to steal from sex workers, and it is an entirely appropriate response by the government that we are expanding the definition of when consent is not given to include false or misleading representations about payment for commercial sexual services. It is the case. It is the case that most sex workers don't work on the street or in brothels. They engage in that private escort work, and that non-payment of service fees is an ongoing problem. That's not just an issue for female sex workers, it's an issue for male sex workers as well. And by criminalising that conduct, we take once again a very important step to making the workplaces of sex workers safe workplaces, because sex work is real work and sex workers ought have the benefit of the protection under law that other workers in other industries have as well. On this side of the chamber, we don't moralise, we don't seek to pass judgment on those career choices. Others may, but we say that if you are a worker and you're being paid for your work, you ought to be able to do that work in a safe way. Deputy Speaker, I have spent perhaps a little bit more time on that matter than I intended, but I did want to just quickly go to a couple of other matters in this bill. And one that has been the topic of discussion in this chamber today is what is known in common parlance as stealthing, namely the removal of a condom during sexual intercourse, or purporting that a condom is there when in fact it is not. This is a form of sexual assault that is insidious and underreported because it comes under the veil of consent, namely that the sex act itself is consented to. So it is important to criminalise this conduct because it radically changes the relationship between the two people who are engaging in that act. And that whilst the act, prima facie might be consented to, it is consented to quite necessarily on a precondition, in many cases, that a prophylactic be worn. And that is to eliminate this egregious behaviour that sees people seeking to take advantage of that conditional consent and distort it for their own purposes into broader consent. I commend this bill to the House.